I'm going to give you both my rankings as well as draft strategy at the quarterback position this year. But the first thing that I need to discuss is that these quarterbacks will be ranked based off a 4-point passing touchdown, a 1 point per 25 passing yards, and -2 point per interception format. Now, instead, if you're playing in a league where you get 6 points per passing touchdown, if you're playing in a league where you get 1 point per 20 passing yards, what you would do there is you would prioritize the quarterbacks that can have an insane amount of passing volume while maybe not going so heavy into the rushers that I'm going to be talking about for this video. But in that format where you only get 4 points per passing touchdown, only get 1 point per 25 passing yards, and you get 6 points per rushing touchdown and 1 point per 10 rushing yards, you will tell with these rankings that I'm going to be prioritizing the guys that can run the ball, such as Josh Allen here at 1. If you are looking at Allen, yes, I know he loses some wide receiver. I mean, you have Stephon Diggs going over to Houston. You have Gabe Davis going over to Jacksonville. And all of a sudden, the situation doesn't look as good for Josh Allen as it did this past year. But to be honest with you, I don't care. Josh Allen's had 3 straight seasons with over 23 points per game. Josh Allen has scored 390 fantasy points at minimum over the past 4 seasons. If you go through it, if you look at all quarterbacks that have similar age, 26, 27, 28 seasons to Josh Allen, you have Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Cam Newton, Carson Wentz, Ryan Tannehill, Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson. And really, the median projection that you should have the following year is about 22.5 points per game, which is where Allen was just at. He gave you 30 rushing yards per contest last year. You have Keon Coleman coming over. You have Curtis Samuel coming over. You have Shakir maybe taking a step up. You have Dalton Kincaid going into year 2. So it's not like it's a garbage situation by any means. So I do think it's a safe spot to have Allen here at 1. Now, I do want to reiterate the overall draft strategy of these guys in tier 1 will be you take your elite level quarterback, and if you draft someone here such as Josh Allen, Jaylen Herz, Lamar Jackson, you are no longer going to be concerned about taking a second quarterback. I personally really like the idea in your league where you only start 2 wide receivers and 1 flex, where quarterback scoring is going to matter a ton, to go with one of these elite options. Don't draft a quarterback 2 and instead roster extra running backs and wide receivers down on the bench. But let's move on over to our quarterback 2, which will be Jaylen Herz. Now, with Jaylen Herz, I understand that some people are going to be a little bit concerned that you have no Jason Kelce. I mean, you also had a fall off at the end of last year. But if you are looking at the change with the offensive coordinator here, I think the play calling is going to be a lot better for this Philadelphia Eagles offense this next season. I think you had a little bit of the Hurts fall off to blame based off Jaylen Hurts injuries down the stretch. And while the tush push may be in a little bit of jeopardy with no Jason Kelce and with the addition of Saquon Barkley, still a very safe spot where you have A.J. Brown, you have Devonta Smith, and if you are looking at Hurts, this is a quarterback that has averaged at least 20 points per game every season over the past 3 years, and in 2022, he was at 25 points per contest. This is the highest mark that we've seen from any quarterback over the past 3 seasons, demonstrating that Jaylen Hurts has an insane ceiling, and there is the possibility that he just comes out here and the new play calling is going to involve up-tempo and just airing the ball out, which would unlock a monstrous ceiling. Now, going over to Lamar for 3 straight seasons now has been about at 20 points per game. If you are looking at Lamar Jackson, the main concern that you're going to have is just the fact that you have seen a considerable amount of injuries over the past 3 seasons. Obviously, he was able to stay healthy this past year. Now, I'm expecting that Lamar comes out here and actually improves with Zay Flowers going into year 2 and with a healthy Mark Andrews. Derrick Henry coming over may limit the amount of rushing touchdowns that Lamar has, because if you get inside the 5-yard line, probably makes more sense to give the ball to Derrick Henry, let him take the wear and tear rather than Lamar possibly just dropping back for no reason. So maybe just the red zone touchdowns go a little bit in the direction of Derrick Henry this next season. But Lamar, 3 straight seasons of over 50 rushing yards per game, still has an improving situation overall. So I think it's safe to have him here in the top tier. But I do want to reiterate, this ranking list is for those 4-point passing touchdown formats, which is why you can clearly tell that we're prioritizing quarterbacks that are going to run the ball, run the ball, run the ball. Whereas we go down to our next tier, we're going to have Patrick Mahomes here, quarterback 4. Now with Mahomes, Yes, he's the best quarterback in the NFL. Nobody's going to argue about that. He just simply doesn't have the same type of rushing upside as those other guys. Now, I know for this reason, a lot of people are looking at Mahomes last year, who only averaged 17.5 points per game, thinking that they're geniuses, going, oh, Patrick Mahomes, he doesn't run the ball enough. You can't draft him in fantasy. He's not an elite quarterback. And they're kind of forgetting the true ceiling that Mahomes has as a passer, where you go back 2 years ago where the game flow was just a little bit different for Mahomes, where they weren't being so conservative and his average depth of target wasn't just so low spread out through this entire offense. 2 years ago, Mahomes was at 24.5 points per game. 2 years ago, Mahomes averaged over 300 passing yards per contest, and he's not Jared Goff. He's not going to have 1 rushing yard per game. He's not Matthew Stafford. He's not going to have 2 rushing yards per game. You're still going to get about 25 rushing yards per game from Mahomes. He's had 3 straight seasons with over 20 rushing yards per contest. So I think it's a very safe pick, and you have to consider that with this situation, Kelsey, we haven't really seen the fall off with yet. And at the same time, you add in a wide receiver in round 1 that has a ton of speed this year with Xavier Worthy. Rashee Rice is going into year 2, and we haven't heard any Rashee Rice suspension news. And you add in Hollywood Brown, which should represent a much better receiving core than what you had a year ago. So maybe Mahomes does air it out a little bit more this season than what you saw last. Now, this is a little interesting. Let's go over and let's look at our 2024 ADP consensus cheat sheet. Because if you're looking at this tier, it's going to be wildly dependent on the platform that you're going to be drafting on for the quarterback that's going to go next. If you're drafting on Underdog Fantasy, which is where I'm drafting every single night on the live stream, you will see Anthony Richardson go like neck and neck with Patrick Mahomes, and you won't see CJ Stroud off the board until we get to the 70s. Sometimes until you get to pick 80 or so does CJ Stroud not come off. However, if you're looking at redraft formats at the moment, you actually have CJ Stroud getting drafted higher than Anthony Richardson on Sleeper. You actually have CJ Stroud getting drafted higher than Anthony Richardson on ESPN. Now, if it's a 4-point passing touchdown format, I think you can take Anthony Richardson ahead of Stroud just based off the overall rushing upside that he gives you. And he could potentially be Josh Allen, averaging 50 rushing yards per game and having double-digit rushing touchdowns, which in a 4-point passing touchdown format is a straight-up cheat code. However, if I'm drafting on Underdog Fantasy and you tell me, Mason, you either have to take Anthony Richardson in round 5 or you get CJ Stroud in round 7, I'm going to go Stroud in round 7. And while I understand a lot of people are concerned that Stroud doesn't have, the Anthony Richardson level ceiling from a rushing perspective, it's not like he's Goff. He's not giving you 1 rushing yard per game. He did have about 11, 12 rushing yards per game this past year. He was a mid-quarterback 1 as a rookie. You add in Stephon Diggs. You have Tank Dell going into year 2. CJ Stroud himself is going into year 2. So I think it's going to be really dependent on the platform that you're drafting on. I will have Stroud ranked behind Richardson in a 4-point passing touchdown format. In Underdog, give me CJ Stroud as discounts. If you're in a 4-point passing touchdown league and you're drafting like on Sleeper, ESPN, you'd probably be better chasing the overall rushing upside of Anthony Richardson because Stroud can be a much, much, much better real life quarterback. And Richardson may end up just being better in fantasy just because he's going to run the ball. But of course, if you want to go out there and draft CJ Stroud in round 7, round 8 of these drafts, go draft with us on Underdog Fantasy. We're drafting there every single night on the live stream. By far and away, my favorite place to draft. They're best ball drafts and no time commitment at all during the year. It's how I draft hundreds of teams every offseason. It's how I won $150,000 on Underdog 2 years ago. And if you use code FLOCK, you're going to get my 2024 fantasy football rankings, my 2024 fantasy football draft guide. You are going to get a 2024 ADP consensus cheat sheet, all of which will be updated for you every Sunday until the season starts. And with code FLOCK, you're going to get a Christian McCaffrey special pick'em, more than less than half a total yard for week 1, a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. And most importantly, you can have some fun getting into some drafts with us. And actually every Monday and Thursday night, we're doing exclusive Flock tournament contest on Underdog, which is super exciting. But let's move down to our next tier. We're going to go Kyler Murray here. Now, Kyler, over the past 2 seasons, has only averaged about 18.5 points per game. Keep in mind, Kyler Murray dealing with an injury, running the ball a little bit less. And also, keep in mind with Kyler, the man had no supporting cast. You're having to force feed Trey McBride an absurd amount of targets because you have a washed Hollywood Brown, and that's about it on this roster. Now you do have Harrison coming in. Marvin Harrison Jr., one of the best wide receiver prospects that we've seen in a very long time. Kyler Murray, 2 years removed from the torn ACL, looks like he's going to be 100% good to go this year. And you have Michael Wilson going into year 2, which should be a very serviceable wide receiver 2. And Trey McBride broke out last year. So across the board, I think that Kyler is actually in a very interesting spot, especially if you can get that bump up with the rushing production. And then Joe Burrow is our next guy. With Burrow, it is difficult for me to sit here and say that we know exactly what's going to happen because obviously this is a wrist injury that we just simply haven't seen a quarterback have to deal with. But y'all know I am one to always trust sportsbook projections over just me rambling randomly on the internet. And right now, if you look at sportsbooks, they currently are projecting the Bengals to average about 24.5 points per game and currently projecting the Bengals to be a borderline top 5 NFL offense. Not to mention Joe Burrow looks healthy at training camp, seems to have no limitations whatsoever. You have Higgins still in town. You have Chase still in town. You go back 2 years ago when he was healthy, he was averaging almost 22 points per contest. Completely fine having Burrow here. And this is another good example of if it's a 6 point per passing touchdown league, there you probably want to move Burrow ahead of Kyler. But the reason he's going to be down here at 8 is just because he doesn't have the same type of rushing upside that you're going to get from Kyler. Now, all of these quarterbacks inside the top 8 will be guys that I do want to hammer in. You're probably only drafting one. Now, if you don't take someone inside the first 8 picks, you still have great high upside options a little bit later on. But I think it becomes a range where you're good to draft 2 quarterbacks and then play them based off matchups and whoever you think has the higher ceiling that week. Going over to Jordan Love, I completely understand. Yes, Jordan Love was phenomenal last season. And what's actually very interesting as well is if you look at Jordan Love's supporting cast, all these guys are really young. You have Dontavian Wicks going into year 2. You have Romeo Doubs going into year 3. You have Christian Watson going into year 3. You have Jaden Reed going into year 2. You have Tucker Kraft going into year 2. You have Luke Musgrave going into year 2. I mean, you have a bunch of young ascending players at your skill positions. This should be an offense where they spread it out to a ton of different options. I know Jordan Love was phenomenal last year, not going to run the ball a ton, and we haven't seen the passing volume be anything close to what you've had historically with like Joe Burrow, with what you've had historically with Patrick Mahomes. And it's also been a very limited sample with Love, right? Where we've seen these guys like Joe Burrow go out there and give us really productive fantasy football seasons for a long duration of time. And it makes it a lot easier to project out going into this next season. Whereas Love, he's looked very good for 1 year. His situation is improving, but I don't know if we can just go all in on this profile off the limited sample where it's not like he was elite in fantasy last year. Dak Prescott was actually better in fantasy last year. Dak Prescott averaged 20 points per game. Now, the issue that I'm going to have with Dak is I personally believe that Rico Dowdle and Ezekiel Elliott will be worse passing down running backs than Tony Pollard was last year. I think Brandon Cooks at wide receiver 2, who's already on the decline going into year 11 of his NFL career. I'm sorry, going into year 12. No, it's year 11. I apologize. But Brandon Cooks going to year 11 of his NFL career is probably going to be a worse wide receiver 2 than he was a year ago. You're dealing with some uncertainty around the CeeDee Lamb situation. The Cowboys were the highest scoring offense in the NFL last season. They're currently projecting, according to sportsbooks, at 24.3 points per game this next year. So I think Dak is like a safe play. The issue is I just don't know if the Dallas Cowboys are really setting him up for success based off the weapons that he has, besides CeeDee Lamb, of course. And then our next guy, I think we can lead off this tier with a couple different options. One, if it's a 6 point passing touchdown format, you're going to go ahead and you're going to take Brock Purdy. In a 4 point passing touchdown league, where you look at Jaden Daniels last year at LSU having 1,100 rushing yards. In a 4 point passing touchdown format, I think we may end up going with Jaden Daniels just strictly because rushing upside. Jaden Daniels could come out here and he could be a bad NFL quarterback. I have no freaking idea how to evaluate these rookie quarterbacks coming into the league. What I do know is he ran the ball a ton in college. He's stepping into a pretty decent situation in Washington if you compare it to what you historically have with quarterbacks that are selected inside the first 3 picks of the NFL draft. So he's going to produce in fantasy no matter what, even if he's bad. And there's the outside chance, oh, what if he's good? And there you obviously have a crazy ceiling for a quarterback that can average 50 rushing yards per game. We'll have Brock Purdy after him. I mean, I'm sure if you all have seen the difference between our Draft Guide 1 versus Draft Guide 2, like I said, we're going to be sending out updated draft guides every single Sunday till the season starts. Use code FLOCK on Underdog. But anyway, you'll probably notice I had Purdy ahead of Daniels. I think now that it looks very clear that Brandon Ayuk is no longer going to be a Niner, I do want to be moving Purdy down just a bit. I think he's going to be a much better NFL quarterback than what you have with Jaden Daniels. Obviously, the issue is just the overall rushing upside, which is what you're going to notice with a lot of these guys. Like our next player will be Tua. Passing volume, very easy to project. I mean, right now, Vegas are saying that the Dolphins should be a top 5 overall offensive points scored. Tua's had back-to-back years with over 270 passing yards. But the issue is the best year of his NFL career, he averaged 17.8 fantasy points per game because last year he averaged 4.4 rushing yards per contest. He's not going to run the ball at all. Caleb is very interesting because Caleb, he's going into a phenomenal situation. Most draft picks that are number 1 selections, they go number 1 to a team that is god awful. The reason being is because the team has to be god awful to get the number 1 overall pick, at least historically. And if they aren't, they have to trade their entire roster to go get the number 1 overall pick. The Bears are in such a unique situation here with Caleb Williams in that they didn't have to do any of that. Instead, you actually had the Bears just lucking their way to the 101 with the Carolina Panthers being an absolute debacle. So Caleb is a quarterback that goes number 1 overall in the NFL draft that is stepping into what should be a phenomenal situation where the Bears have been able to overhaul this roster over the past few years with their rebuilds. Not only do they have massive improvements with the offensive line, but they also have Komet stepping into his prime, DJ Moore currently in his prime, the addition of a top 10 NFL draft pick in Rome Odunze and Keenan Allen. Now, with Caleb, I think he's going to be a much better NFL quarterback than Jaden Daniels this year. And he had 11 rushing touchdowns last year at USC, but only 142 rushing yards. So I don't know how much we can realistically expect Caleb Williams to be running the ball at the NFL level. It will be something that we have to monitor, and there's a wide range of outcomes. But then afterwards, we're going to be going with Lawrence and Goff. I think the Detroit Lions probably want to run the ball a ton. Jared Goff's not going to run the ball at all. Averaged 1.2 rushing yards per game last year. I know Trevor Lawrence wasn't great last season, averaged 16.5 points per contest, really failed down the stretch. But I think a lot of that had to do with the ankle injury that you had from Lawrence. And while, Ridley's gone, Zay Jones is gone, I actually think you get an upgrade in the form of Brian Thomas Jr. as well as Gabe Davis this year. So I think it's a pretty good spot for Trevor Lawrence to have a little bit of a pseudo injury bounce back. So like I said, that's going to be about the tier where you kind of want to be taking 2 of these guys and then playing the matchups. Now, the next tier that we're going to go to, these are guys that in your regular redraft league where you're only drafting 1 quarterback, I highly recommend just looking at the very end of your draft. It's going to be Herbert, Cousins, Stafford. So with Justin Herbert dealing with an injury, new coaching staff, massive overhaul at wide receiver, I think that he is much better from an NFL perspective than a ton of the quarterbacks ranked before him. But it seems like this coaching staff's probably going to want to run the ball. If you look at sportsbooks at the moment, they're only projecting the Chargers to score 22 points per game. And the situation just doesn't look that great for Herbert. If you're looking at Cousins and Stafford, these are quarterbacks that we can very confidently say there's going to be a ton of passing volume in their respective offenses, right? Which will be great for the wide receivers here. The issue is Cousins over the last 3 years. I mean, last year he averaged 3.1 rushing yards per game. And Stafford last year averaged 1.4 rushing yards per game. So just the straight upside that you have in a 4-point passing touchdown format really isn't there unless you expect these quarterbacks to be top 3 in the NFL in passing yards and passing touchdowns. And now dropping down to our next 2 tiers. These will be quarterbacks that I think are only relevant if you are playing in best ball or a super flex league. So I don't want to talk about these guys too much. We're going to have Rodgers, Deshaun, Fields, Geno, Baker, Levis. Really, the only interesting player to talk about with this tier will be Justin Fields. I'm ranking Justin Fields here under the assumption that Russell Wilson is the starting quarterback. If I thought Justin Fields was the starting quarterback, Justin Fields, based off his rushing upside, would be moved up to the Jordan Love, Dak Prescott tier. Now, of course, in your regular 1 quarterback redraft league, I'm not advocating for you to go out there and draft Justin Fields. I'm not advocating for you to go out there and pick up any of these players unless it's best ball, unless it's super flex. These guys should be on the waiver wire. And then looking at the last tier, Daniel Jones, Drake May, Bryce Young, JJ McCarthy, Derek Carr, Bo Nix, Russell Wilson. Kind of the same thing here. Unless it's a super, super deep league, unless it's a best ball format on Underdog, unless you're playing in a super flex format. These tiers of quarterbacks are probably guys that are better off being spent on the waiver wire. But from an overall strategy perspective, I do want to just hammer in. If you draft a top 6 to 8 quarterback, I'm probably not taking another one at all. If you wait until Jordan Love to take your first QB or any point after that, I'm probably going to look to take 2 quarterbacks, whether that's Daniels and Tua, whether that's Purdy and Caleb, whether that's Love and Cousins. It doesn't really matter. I think if you wait till QB 9, you want to grab 2 guys between 9 and 19, play the matchups between the two. And yeah, if you're in a regular shallow redraft format, don't be drafting anybody past 20. Leave them on the waiver wire. If you need a backup quarterback, say you draft Josh Allen, he has a bye week in week 12, just go ahead, pick up, I don't know, Deshaun Watson for the week. But appreciate you. Really hope that you're able to get something with this video. Couple of reminders. 1, if you want my draft guide, if you want all our rankings updated constantly until the season starts, you can get that by joining Underdog Fantasy, making a $10 deposit with code FLOCK. You'll get my draft guide. You'll get our 2024 ADP consensus cheat sheet. You will get my 2024 fantasy football rankings, a 50% deposit bonus up to $250, and a Christian McCaffrey special pick of more than less than half a total yard. And you get into drafts with us every single night. Also, we have the Flock meetup coming up very soon, August 22nd in Austin, Texas. If you're in Houston, if you're in Dallas, if you're in San Antonio, especially if you're in Austin, I expect to see you there. You can grab a ticket to that at flockfantasy.store. Only $15. I'm giving away free merch. We just have to tell the venue how many people are going to be there. I'm sorry that we have to sell tickets in the first place. But appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day. And really hope that I get to see you out in the live stream and draft with you tonight.